Hey, it's Joel. In this episode of PHQ, we have explicit language. So if you're with kids or you're in a public setting or you're at work, make sure you're mindful that this episode contains explicit language. We want to make you aware of that before we get started. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, and welcome to PHQ, Questions from the Personality Hacker Community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And let's get right to our question this week.
Hi, my name is Rita, and I'm an ENTP. I had a question specifically about being an NT female. My best friend is an INTJ. I'm an ENTP, and this has resulted in some interesting situations where we just don't show up to the world the way that it seems like it's expected a woman should show up to the world. It's been really great to know each other because it's, a fact that, we're not the only ones. The fact that we're not super in tune to emotion doesn't necessarily make us an alien. And so I was wondering if you guys had any advice or any insight into what it means to be an NT woman and how that shows up in the world, and advice you have for maintaining femininity in a personality type that's so typically associated with men.
Thanks, Rita, for the question. This is something that is near and dear to our heart because Antonia is also an ENTP female, and I'm an ENFP male, so I deal with some of this on the male side as well. What I think is really powerful about your story or interesting about your story is you have your best friend is also an NT female, which helps a little bit because, you might be listening right now to Rita's question here on the show and say, well, I'm also an NTP female, but I don't have, or an NT female, and I don't have anybody else in my life that can resonate with what I'm going through. And I feel so alone. I feel like I'm such an odd duck from everybody else around me, from all the other women that are showing up and telling me how I have to be, that I envy her. I envy you, Rita, that you've got another female friend that is also an NT that you can share ideas with and understand what that experience is like.
Yeah, I think that's a major advantage. And in fact, in the question of what kind of advice to give, I would say that that's a big one. Find like-minded people. Find people who are similar to you. And in this case, an intuitive thinker that is a female. A fellow female who is an NT is going to go a long way in helping you feel like you mentioned, less alien. But as far as, I think there was a couple things in here that I'd like to speak to directly. And before I get to that, I just want to make a little asterisk. We actually did a full hour-long podcast on being thinker females and feeler males.
Yeah, one of our first. I think it's in the first 10 podcasts we've ever done.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, because it's been on our mind for a long time. And so feel free to go listen to that. It's not specifically about NT females, but obviously I'm going to have an unconscious bias that I will bring into those kinds of conversations since I am an NT. So there's probably some gold to be mined from that particular podcast. The question of how to maintain a sense of femininity being an intuitive thinker woman is I think it's an important question. We have, a lot of what we get as models in front of us of how we're supposed to be behaving is, I think that it's like a macro or social way of personality profiling all of us. When people talk about, gender being social constructs and the way that we're supposed to be, I'm using air quotes that you can't see, the way that we're supposed to be showing up as men and women, I think that's just society doing really sort of generic personality profiling. They're finding patterns of behavior, and then they're overvaluing those patterns, or they're even maybe projecting those patterns onto all of us. And so when we don't fit the generic model or the generic pattern, then we forget that this is just an attempt to model the world and understand it. We sometimes overvalue it and think it's reality. We buy it because so many people are saying it. And so we have a tendency to default to the fallacy that if everybody seems to be saying this thing, it must be right. And it's difficult to find our way when we not only don't fit the model, but maybe fit a model that is more often applied to the opposite gender. Like, I think one of the challenges that thinker women have is not just that they're not part of the stereotypical female spectrum, but they're more placed, and especially as intuitive thinker women, they're more placed in the definitively male spectrum. Like, this is what a man is supposed to be showing up as. So not only are you trying to find your way in the matrix of femininity or womanhood, you're also trying to avoid feeling like you might be a man somehow, like deep down inside. And that gets into all sorts of problem areas, I think, when I remember when I was younger, I'm now 39 years old. When I was younger, as a teenager, I used to say that I'm a dude trapped in a woman's body, which did me no good. There was nothing good that came from that mentality, but that's how I felt. I felt like I didn't see any models of women around me that were similar enough to be able to go, okay, oh yeah, there's definitely femininity expressed in a way that I can relate to.
You're not talking about gender identity issues for yourself. Like, this was not something you were like, maybe I'm a man. You were talking about how you show up to the world, the behaviors and things. This is not like you felt like you needed to change your gender ultimately.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't feel like I was actually a man and that I should have been born a man. I felt fully woman. I just felt like I didn't have a place as a woman showing up the way that I did. And the only models I could see in front of me were men. And I think that that's a really good distinction to make. Thank you, Joel. So I would be like, yeah, I'm on the inside, I'm a dude, and on the outside, I'm a chick. And that didn't really serve me because it kind of made me feel like a stranger in a strange land. I didn't really feel like I had... I kind of felt like I was on the outside of the entire conversation. I didn't feel like a man. I didn't feel like a woman. And this is, of course, way before these concepts of different gender identities and fluidity. It felt like a lot more black and white back in the 90s when I was a teenager. And so I didn't really know where I fit. And so in a lot of conversations around, say, feminism, I never really identified with feminists. And in conversations around misogyny or misandry, I didn't really understand any of those conversations because I didn't really feel like, I'm like, why are people making such strong distinctions here? And because I didn't make strong distinctions, because I kind of felt like I was on the outside looking in, the whole conversation confused me enough where I just didn't even enter the conversation. I just ignored it. So what I ended up doing is whenever anybody around me said something, I don't know, I mean, you could call it, at this point in my life, I actually think that it's really, really subtle sexism, but I don't really think of it as I think it's quietly potentially dangerous, but I don't think it's an overt thing that people were trying to subjugate me around. But my dad's in his 70s and my father-in-law is in his late 60s, and I would hear these comments about how emotional women were and how you just can't trust women because they're so emotional and they shouldn't be in positions of leadership. And what was crazy is that as opposed to getting offended and being like, well, you can't say that about me, that's not how I am, I didn't even think they were talking about me. When they were saying things like, women are so emotional, I didn't identify with a moniker of woman enough to be able to say yes or no to that. I would just look at them and find it interesting that they felt that way about women. I think when I was really young, I bought into it enough to go, yeah, that's how women are. And I got disabused of that notion pretty quickly when I was like, wait, I'm a woman. But I think what ended up happening is I just felt like I wasn't a part of the conversation at all. And what that was double-edged. On one side of the coin, I think it served me because I didn't get reactionary. I wasn't reacting in an offended way. I just would look at the person, and I didn't realize it was happening at the time, but it has since become a go-to strategy of mine, because I would just look at the person who was saying that, and they would look at me and realize that I wasn't following the rule that they had just mentioned. Then there obviously are clear exceptions, and I noticed that they would get awkward and uncomfortable with the statement they had just made, because they would be looking at me and saying women are all emotional and you can't trust them, and I would just look at them and blink. And then they'd get self-conscious. They would make, these exceptions to the rule, well, maybe not you. And the whole thing was just fascinating. I was just purely observation mode. But now I've realized in my older age that is a fantastic strategy, by the way. If somebody makes some sort of blanket statement about how the world is supposed to be working, And it could be perceived as offensive to you, but you just look at the person like you have no idea what they're talking about, or what they're talking about is like, like just obviously so fascinating to you because it's so easy to ignore or to refute. A lot of times people will just kind of back off and they'll get self-conscious because you didn't react to them. So that became like a strategy of mine, made completely. I mean, I stumbled upon it by complete accident. So that was the good thing that came out of it. But the bad thing that came out of it is that I never felt a sense of femininity. I never felt a sense of sisterhood. When people would talk about sisterhood, especially when I started to hang out with more of like a woo-woo crowd, I would call it. People who are like really into the personal development world and doing all sorts of seminars and events and women's empowerment and and they would talk about this concept of sisterhood. I had no idea what they're talking about. And that wasn't to say that I didn't reach out for that. It's not to say that I wouldn't put myself in those situations. I just never felt like I belonged. I just couldn't get it. And I realized that it wasn't that these women were trying to exclude me. There was a little part of me that wondered if it was like, oh, they all are in on some joke that I'm just not in on. And so maybe that this is part of like the exclusionary thing where like, if you're not in on the joke or you're not in, you didn't get the memo, then you're not invited. And you might be able to show up in body, but we're just kind of throwing you a bone. You're not really actually supposed to be here. And I realized that wasn't it at all. I realized that they had bought the whole premise of women being a certain way too. And because they identified with it more, then they had no problem connecting on that level. And so that was just, everybody had just bought this. And so they were connecting on something that was a social, you can call it social construct. I'm going to call it social pattern recognition that gets overvalued. So they connected on that overvalued social pattern. And I just didn't. And they didn't know that I wasn't. And it just all kind of felt weird. And I realized that one of the things I needed to do was I needed to insert myself into the conversation and help them understand that there were other models. And personality psychology has been hugely helpful for me because I have language around all this. So last year I went to a birthday party of a friend of mine. And what she does every year for her birthday is she facilitates a Women's Day retreat. And so I showed up there. I was surrounded by women. The only other NT woman in the entire group could only stay for breakfast and then had to leave. And otherwise, I was surrounded by feeler women. And what I presented was a short little talk on what it's like to be a thinker and a woman at the same time. And I could tell that most of the women that I was presenting this to didn't, it was interesting to them. Some of the women, it just was so outside their experience, it didn't matter. But other women, it was almost the first time they had ever considered any of the concepts. In fact, I would say for most of them it was. And so I realized that a part of my being part of the matrix of femininity or the matrix of womanhood is to show up and represent that perspective. So I think a part of the piece of reclaiming femininity as a woman is making sure that, like you guys are doing, you're hanging out with a like-minded person and reminding myself. I have a really wonderful friend who is the chair of sociology at a major Ivy League university here in the United States. She's an INTJ. And whenever I think about other women going through the same thing that I'm going through and trying to figure it all out, like I'm trying to figure it all out, I always reference her because, she's done the same thing. She's become part of, women's retreats and women's empowerment groups and gone off on a lot of different, just really worked hard to explore this aspect of who she is. And she succeeded. She found sisterhood. She found a group of women that she feels incredibly comfortable with. And so I know it can happen because I look at her and I model her and I go, you can find that piece of femininity.
I'll agree with you that she has found sisterhood, but I have noticed that even in the midst of connecting with other women, I've noticed that NT women still are somewhat outliers ultimately. I know a lot of NT women who run in the circles we run in, and they're still in a satellite. They're not completely integrated into that community of sisterhood like you're talking about. There's still something that's still separate out from that. And I say that to say, not to make you feel demoralized, Rita, or anyone else listening that's an NT woman, but to understand that you may not fully integrate, at least from my standpoint. Again, I'm not a woman. Maybe the experience is different here. But from what I see, there's not a full integration. There's more than probably you would realize. But I think as an NT woman, you're never going to be fully integrated in that sisterhood community. And I don't mean to be demoralizing. Maybe you can speak to that, but that's from my perspective.
No, I think there's some realism there. When you say fully integrated in that sisterhood, what was the word you used?
The person you're talking about, I know they've done a lot of this work and they're really involved. But when I talk to her, there's still like, she's still an NT woman and she's still like, yeah, it's great. But there's like that 10% missing that if she was a feeler, I think it would be clicked in. You know what I'm talking about?
Community was the word you used.
Yeah.
That sisterhood community. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's different layers here. The sisterhood community, being fully integrated in the sisterhood community, is like being fully. I mean, I'm thinking of that as being like fully welcomed.
Yes.
And I think she's been fully welcomed.
Absolutely.
And I think that she's done what she can to insert herself into it. I don't think she's holding back. She's allowing herself to be vulnerable and show up different and be willing to take whatever criticism or misunderstanding comes her way from that. So I think she's been fully integrated in that way, but I agree what you're saying. With what you're saying, I think that there's a little piece missing. And I don't think it's a make wrong or anybody's doing anything wrong. I think what it is we feel the most integrated when we feel the most understood. And there's always going to be a piece of misunderstanding from a feeler woman to a thinker woman. And so I think that's one of the reasons why having a blended group of both feeler and thinker women in those kinds of communities is really important. And that's why I think representing and showing up as a thinker woman is so important. So, nobody's blending. Nobody's in hiding. You can see how there's a blend of the two and it becomes a more cohesive arrangement.
What I've noticed is you and her, when you get together, do have a really tight connection. You have a deeper connection, I would say. And again, I haven't observed her as much with feeler women, but it looks like, at least from the surface, from my viewpoint, that you guys have a really interesting, deep connection that she just couldn't find with feeler women. And that's not to say to cut feeler women out. I don't think like thinker women should just get in their own little like groups and never associate. I think what you're talking about, that blending idea, is great. But what it is like if there's one thinker woman and like 10 feeler women in a group that are hanging out for a weekend, it's going to be a little bit of a mismatch. And that thinker's going to always feel a little bit odd woman out. But if there's like 5 thinkers and 5 feelers, well, now there's a bit more of a blending of personalities and styles. And I think you're going to have a little more simpatico because you're going to have those other thinkers there with you. I think that's all I'm trying to say is often when you're a thinker woman, you're inserted into situations where you're the only one. Or you have like maybe one friend, like you, Rita. You've got one friend who's an INTJ female, and so there's 2 of you, but it's not like there's this broader context. So all I'm saying is, I think that if you can find a way to have a broader context in the midst of all this, you're going to have a better experience of integrating with that sisterhood.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
And again, I'm a dude. I don't know what I'm talking about as far as the women go, but like in this particular standpoint, this is just my observation as this is what I do for a living.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I'm glad that, I'm monopolizing this entire PHQ because I'm an NT woman, so I guess I just decided that I was going to do all the talking, and I'm glad that you added that piece because I think it's really important. I think on top of that, and I don't know what your situation is, Rita. I don't know what the situation that you, the listener, is in if you are an NT woman. I'm talking about it from my personal experience, which over the last few years has included a lot of women's empowerment groups and concepts because I'm just, that's the world that I live in. I live in the personal development world. So I end up in those situations a lot. And I've noticed that the marketing and the appeal to those sorts of events, seminars, sisterhood groups is very feeler focused. And so when you go to those kinds of situations, the situation that Joel just mentioned, which is like 1 thinker woman and 10 feeler women, is a very likely outcome because the marketing was focused on the highest demographic of women, which is feelers. And so that's probably a lot of what you're going to be looking at. And I've actually even considered, I've considered. I've thought about how that seems to be missing, which is the concept of creating femininity and sisterhood around being a thinker woman. I think that feels like a niche that's just going unmet. That's like a need going perpetually unmet. But how would you go about that? How would you appeal to thinker women and get something like that going? I've been idea generating around it for a long time. One thing I should mention really quick before we wrap this up, because I don't know if any of this has been helpful because it's mostly been my experience, but one of the things I want to mention that has helped me out a lot as well is this idea of separating feminine and masculine energy from gender and or sexual identity. The feminine and masculine energies they're like para of your gender identity. There are men who have feminine energy and there are women who have masculine energy. And this concept of the energies, and a lot of this information I've culled from works like David Data's stuff, where the masculine energy is still. It's a container. It moves slowly. It is meant to be it's supposed to create a safe space container. And the feminine energy is in motion. It's like a dance. It's beautiful and it's seductive and it's a dance. And the only time that it can really fully show up with that dance is when it's when it has a masculine container to keep it safe. And when you are attracted to somebody, when you are basically you have this magnetic feel to that person, a lot of what's happening is the polarity of the masculine and the feminine energies, regardless of the person's gender identity. That's what's at play, is those masculine and feminine energies that are magnetically attracted to each other. So what I did inside myself is figure out where I have a tendency to land. And I always assumed I was more masculine, but when I started to think of it in terms of energy, there are aspects and elements of me that are quite masculine. Like whenever I'm in a truly thinker space, when I'm talking about data and information and I'm teaching, on the podcast, you can hear my voice get real low and I get real steady. Most of the time when I'm on the podcast talking, I'm real low and real steady because I'm in a super introverted thinking or accuracy space. And that is a masculine energy space for me. Every other moment, if you hung out with me just casually, my tonality is not like what it is on the podcast, I would say. Would you agree with that, Joel?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you're in a coaching standpoint in real life, or you're talking about data again, you're much like the podcast, but hanging out, having fun, yeah, you're much more free form, much more emotive, much more creative in your idea generation. All of that is very fluid.
Yeah, I have a tendency to be a lot more casual and chill, and but not in like a steady way. I have a tendency to be not casual and chill. I'd say I'm more chill on the podcast than I am in real life. Like I have a tendency to be a little bit more lively, and I do a lot more joking in real life, and I do a lot more I'm very playful in real life, I would say. And unless I'm in a serious conversation, and then I get like really serious. But that playfulness is my feminine energy coming out. And I have that in buckets. And then whenever I'm in an emotional space, I am super feminine in an emotional space. And so there were all these areas of my life that I didn't just see the feminine energy like a space for it to be expressed. It was expressed without intention. It was just there. I was just deeply feminine in all these different areas of my life. And that reminded me that I was oversimplifying things, that I was seeing things in too much of this, social pattern recognition and overemphasizing the importance of it, because I didn't show up in a feminine way and say my desire to look a certain way and stay on trend, or, how I did my hair and makeup, or how I debated, like all of these things. Like I felt like these were the sum total of who I was, until I started noticing that is not at all the sum total of who I am. Those are aspects and areas in which I have masculine energy. And then there's a ton of other areas where I have feminine energy. And that was helpful. I got to rest into that. And when I rested into that, I started to find that feminine energy felt more permission to come out to play in all areas of my life. And I rested into that, knowing that I'm deeply feminine. I think I got more seductive as a person. I got more flirtatious. I got more, I guess the word is comfortable with my own sexuality. And I got more comfortable with who I am and how I show up. So I do highly recommend looking at maybe different models of feminine and masculine energy, and determining whether or not some of the messaging you may have gotten, or even messaging that has come up for you based on the models that you've seen in the outside world, if maybe that's an oversimplification of who you are, and really rest into the feminine aspects of who you are, or not, if that's not what you want to do. There are also women who love showing up with a masculine energy, and they have a tendency to be attracted to people who show up with a more feminine energy, and that's perfectly acceptable as well.
I think what we're talking about here is the fundamental wiring versus your behavior. And this goes to what we talk about around personality types all the time. You might be an ENTP, for example, whatever gender, whatever energy, but not all ENTPs are created the same. We're talking about the wiring of your mind when we say ENTP. We talk about how you're learning information and making decisions. Your behavior is going to show up based on your experience, about your history, about where you are in life, about who you are, about your gender, all these things. And I think the same thing happens here too. If you look at behavior and say, okay, that person's showing up feminine because they're behaving in this feminine way, quote unquote, whatever that means for your culture, your time period, you're ignoring that energy aspect that you're talking about, Antonia. And I think if somebody hung out with you in real life, okay, you don't have a lot of the markers, the traditional markers of the quote unquote feminine woman. I mean, you're beautiful, you're feminine in your expression, but your behaviors are still your unique behaviors, but you're pulling them from a feminine energy. So what's exciting about that is, Rita, we go all the way back to your first question, is how do I as an NT woman show up feminine? Well, it's rest into that energy that you bring. If you are a truly feminine woman, rest into that. And don't give a crap if people say, well, that behavior is not feminine enough. Well, who are they to say that your true expression of your femininity isn't that behavior? They're talking about behavioral levels to assign yourself or align yourself with the cultural norms. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about showing up authentically, expressing yourself, or what makes sense for you to express yourself. And that will come out different for different people. It doesn't mean that you're not feminine. It just means you don't maybe express it in the same way that culture says you have to on a behavioral level. I think that's what we're really talking about, is that femininity underneath the behavior.
Yeah, we give a lot of power to society, assuming that if everybody is echoing the same thing, they must have figured something out. And we give society just way too much power. Way too much power for having figured things out that I don't think that they figured out. The other thing is that femininity might be more subtle for you, and there is beauty in subtlety. I think there's a lot of beauty in the subtle feminine aspects that an NT woman, or even just a thinker woman in general, can bring. I have one more thing to say before this is going to be like the longest PHQ ever, because I have so much to say on this topic. But I have one more thing before we wrap it up. I said that I had one more thing before we wrapped it up before, but I actually have yet another thing. But you wanted to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that. So the other piece of this too is on a personality type basis. We look at the behaviors coming from certain types, and because certain types, for example, over 50%, around 50% of women use extroverted feeling. And extroverted feeling, which we've nicknamed harmony, is all about connection, all about creating harmony in the outside world, about making sure that we have a lot of social interactions and engagements steadied in our world. Well, if 50% of the population of women show up with this, it's very easy for people to go, okay, all of the behaviors coming from the most of the women I know, that's what femininity looks like. But that's just one expression of women, and it just happens to be a large population. That doesn't mean that's femininity. That just means that's FE femininity, or that's how an FE would go about it. And what's interesting about extroverted feeling, or what I'm using as shorthand FE, is that it is about social contracts and how we're going to behave as society. So a lot of it is, I wouldn't say groupthink or hive mind, but a lot of it is, I definitely want to be in alignment as a extroverted feeler, as an FJ in the Myers-Briggs system. I want to be in alignment with what society deems as appropriate or inappropriate, because that's my power. That's my superpower. I want to connect on that level. And so what can often happen is it just looks like you look out over the world and it looks like all of the other women around you are on the same page and you're the odd person out. And again, that comes down to that behavioral level. That's not femininity. That's one expression of femininity that happens to be a large population of women. And that's just what we've looked at and said, oh, we're going to take all of our cues from that. Nothing could be further from the truth. Femininity can show up in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to look like extroverted feeling or harmony, which, Rita, would actually be your 10-year-old or tertiary process in your cognitive function stack or your personality. So I just want to make that statement there, that we can overvalue a large populace, and this is how the behavior has to come out. But that doesn't mean the underwiring of your femininity isn't there ultimately.
Yeah. That thing that I wanted to mention before we wrapped up is the idea of marginalizing your own, I don't want to use the word intelligence, because I know that there's a lot of stereotypes around NTs being smarter than everybody else. And I think there's certain ways in which NTs have a trend toward outperforming other types in some of the ways in which we define intelligence. So that's a mouthful to say that there are lots of different styles of intelligence, and our society just happens to overvalue certain aspects of those, like certain intelligences, and NTs have a tendency to perform well in those areas. So there's a lot of stereotypes around NTs being smarter than everybody else, which I don't think is accurate, but I do understand why there are those trends. So that was my huge, like, sort of bookend to say that the elements that you bring to the world that are part of that stereotype or trend toward appearing more intelligent, there are social tropes or social archetypes or stereotypes that indicate that a woman is supposed to show up with a certain style of intelligence. Oftentimes it's emotional and social intelligence, based on a lot of what Joel just mentioned, with a lot of women being extroverted, using extroverted feeling as one of their main functions, even introverted feeling as one of their main functions. I mean, like 75%, I believe it's 75% of women are feelers. Almost 50% are using extroverted feeling, and another 25 to 30% are using introverted feeling. So 3 out of 4 women are going to be feelers, and 1 out of 4 women is going to be a thinker. And so all of the stereotypes trend towards an emotional or social intelligence. And there's going to be some of us who show up with what is considered more masculine intelligence, which is logic and spatial awareness, and think about all the ones that men are supposed to test really well on in IQ tests versus what women test well on. And I just really want to make an admonition: if you are an NT woman, never dumb that down. Like, at no point. And NT women, one of the major challenges they have or complaints they have is that they can't dumb it down. And what do they do when they can't?
Also, don't apologize for it.
That's
if
the
you
other
can't
piece.
dumb it down, don't say, I'm sorry for this.
That's the other piece, is that when you can't dumb it down, because you won't be able to as an NT woman, never apologize for it. Now, at the same time, try not to get prickly in your defense of it. Don't get defensive. There's nothing to defend. You are simply showing up as you are wired. And there's no reason to apologize for it, but there's no reason to defend it either. You simply show up as you are. And I have noticed that the less fucks that I give about other people looking at my, like assessing women's intelligence in front of me, or assessing my intelligence as a woman, the less fucks I give, the better I do. I just don't care. If I show up in front of somebody and they make some sort of comments around, and this will happen from both men and women, make comments around women's place, or that they can't be great business leaders, or that they're worse, let's say they're worse at math, or worse drivers, or like whatever else are the stereotypes around women and femininity or whatever. Like, I just do whatever I want to. I just live my life. If somebody were to try to put a glass ceiling above me, like, I don't know if I would feel like this fight to break through the glass ceiling. I would just go up, around, over, through. Like, I would just do whatever it took to get to the thing that I want. Because I recognize that life is going to give you obstructions no matter who you are, no matter what your context is. It's not just certain people who get obstructions. Everybody gets obstructions. Everybody will have something put in front of them that is effectively an "Are you sure?" button from the universe that goes, "Are you sure you really want this? Because I'm going to put something in front of you, and if you don't really want it, then go do something else." Everybody faces that, and as a woman, we have some of those, and as NT women, we have some of those. And my strongest recommendation is just don't care. Just go around them. Just do whatever it is. Like, get your goal accomplished however you want to accomplish it. And that means that you're going to have to know yourself. It means that you're going to have to dive deep and go, what is the thing that I want? So the biggest question should not be, how do I get people to acknowledge, respect me? How do I get people to see me as what I can be? The biggest question is, what do I want out of life? And then use that NT mind to start strategizing to get there. And in the meantime, on this, all the other components that we talked about, like on an ancillary level, just fully recognize your femininity, however you have it, or be okay with having more of a masculine energy. Whatever works for you is completely acceptable and fine. Just never, ever defend your brilliant mind, because you don't have to. There's nothing to defend. Just express it and allow the universe to melt around you.
And it might be polarizing. You might have people that you polarize because of that. But what's interesting is there's always two sides to the polarization. You might distance yourself from some people, but you'll become magnetically attractive to other people, both men and women. And I think that the people in your life that are supposed to be there will be attracted to you if you show up as your true self, your deepest self. So thanks, Rita, for the question. If you have a question for us, you can head over to personalityhacker.com/questions. You can record your question like Rita did, or you can type your question in, and we'll get to those as we can. We got a lot of them pouring in, and so it might be a little bit before we get to it, but we try to get to all of these questions over time, and we have more than we can even answer. So it's definitely a challenge, but we're working on it. Also, we want to encourage you to join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This has been PHQ, Questions from the Personality Hacker community. We'll talk with you on the next episode.